and
not required, madam. Continue कर लीजिए, continue कर लीजिए.
Okay. Okay. So I hope you are able to see the screen now.
Yes, ma'am. It is visible, ma'am.
Make it full screen
now. Full screen.
Yeah. So let me begin today. It's a pleasure again to meet everybody at IGNO at the PGDSS program. And today we are actually going to discuss two very important topics. One is concept of sustainability science, which we have dealt with pretty well in the last few classes. And we have a good understanding, of what sustainability is and how sustainability science itself places in the argument between growth, development, and conservation of nature. So we have that kind of overview that we have already seen. Now, today we are actually going to look at the concept in terms of how it is going to perform in practice, right? So here the importance is also towards sustainability indicators. So quickly, if we go, we are going to see what is the cause, how science forwards the cause of sustainability. And that is mostly in terms of measurement of sustainability and the indicators themselves. So actually Brundtland Commission, if you see, it defines sustainability very practically. Okay, so it said that it is a composite. Sustainability in terms of, we have seen it as conceptual, we've seen it as theoretical, and we have also seen it as how it can be a medium, for development and growth in sustainable terms. But sustainability itself is also seen as a composite measure and hence an ambitious policy target. So here we are seeing how science is, able to help us in making sustainability a composite measure or a quantitative element. So here we have data, we have an interface, and we have tools. So put together, using these three things, data, interface, and tools, we will be able to measure sustainability in terms of quantifying how they are, the sustainability concept itself is taken forward in the society and in different strata of or sectors of society, we can say domestic sector, the industrial sector, and the rural, the urban, all these sectors. And also we will be able to judge how well these are being able to meet the goals of sustainability itself. So here, if we take data can be measured. Okay, so data is something, how can we measure data? That is what we are asking. We are talking in terms of sustainability. So data on sustainability needs to be measured both quantitatively and qualitatively. And this can be done by what are known as a set of indicators. Okay, so these indicators are very, very crucial for us to deal with the interface with society that we have, so that the sustainability concepts are actually put into practice through scenarios. We examine actually what are the existing scenarios and what new scenarios can build up more sustainability element into the society. And that again goes as data, and that data is quantified qualitatively and quantitatively. Also, this interface where the society meets sustainability elements itself, we need some tools for this to happen. So those tools are the implementation tools, and policies are the very important implementation tools to achieve sustainability for the societal terms. Okay, so here now we are going to see, I'm going to show a slide where we are going to take an example which has been quoted in a paper by Valentin and Spangenberg. So it's a very, very nice way of representing the importance of these tools, the interface, as well as what we call as the data itself. So, okay, so here now I want to take your attention to the graph which is there on your left-hand side. If you see, the environmental element is at the center of this triangle, right? You're seeing, and we have the economic, social, and institutional elements which interlink with this environmental interface at various levels. So let us take, now we are seeing that there are some goals. If we need to achieve some goals of sustainability, we need to first spell out the goals. So those goals are spelled out in some of those boxes, gray boxes that you can see. And how to measure these goals are also spelled out in terms of the indicators. Now, if we take the environmental aspect. Okay, so the triangle between environmental, economic, social correspond to the 3 pillars of sustainability that we have been talking about, which is the core central concept of sustainability. Let us see, if we take the leftmost corner, let us start from the economic side. Okay, so here you can see that goal number 1 is efficient use of resources. That is on your left hand side. So how do we measure efficient use of resources in economic ways? Okay, using proper indicators. Indicators mentioned here, these are all examples of indicators. Number 1 is use of drinking water for industrial production. That is one indicator. How much of drinking water is being used for industrial purpose, right? Second example is the money paid for testing ecological technology, maybe for remediation or recovery. So this is these, say an industry selects these 2 indicators to see how efficiently they are using the water resources. So this is a very nice example, but what we have to think is this a practical set of indicator? The indicators that are shown here, the 2 indicators which we have taken in an example, are they practical? And also, will they be useful in futuristic terms also, right? And also, are they robust in showing the present existing scenario? So these are the questions that come to our mind when we look at indicators which are defined for this particular goal. Now, if we see another goal, example, target-oriented school education and training. So this is something, it's a different goal from industry itself. We are moving on to more of the education sector. So the indicator that is mentioned here is how many people are finding a job because of their attending this training course. Okay, so the participation in training course, how it leads to employment. That is one indicator. Second indicator can be, example is how many number of students are allotted to per teacher, or how much, what is the student teacher ratio, right? So this is one particular indicator. So do these 2 indicators actually give data, meaningful data, and which is not manipulative, to assess what the goal has been achieved or not? So if we think, yes, if we have target, we have a target oriented curriculum as our own. So we have a target oriented teaching. If we see that if so many people are attending this, are going on and finding jobs, yes, it can be a very robust and it can be a very practical indicator of how well the students are doing. If we see how many number of students per teacher are there, it might not be a direct indicator. So here we are coming to direct and indirect indicator. Direct indicator is the effect of having that education itself, which the goal wants to judge. But if we have something, if the number of students per teacher is huge and the teacher is not able to give attention, it means that it can result in number of students going on to finding suitable employment because they could not successfully complete the course because of the less attention that they are receiving. If this is the basis with which, or the hypothesis with which we are examining this data set, then this is an indirect estimate or indirect indicator. So there can be direct and indirect indicator. Similarly, if we move on to some say examples from the social or the society aspect, regionalization of any event or any product or any market. Let us take regionalization as an example. So the indicator used to assess this is what are the number of markets of natural products which were present in that region during the past 1 year. How the markets opened up for the product, say a natural product. Then what is the distance covered by a product from the place of its origin to the place where it's being sold, right? So this is an indicator. As you can see, both are typically direct indicators in this aspect, but the reach of this indicator, by the reach, I mean the scale of this indicator is quite regional. So the first example we saw of industry is a very localized example of indicators. Set of indicators is very localized. The second, if you see, it is actually transitional because the origin of education happens at some place but people go out and find jobs and people prosper in the society in many, many different ways. So it is a very transitional set of indicators. The one that we are seeing now, regionalization, the example is very, very effective in getting regional scale data, right? So the data that is coming in is of regional scale. If we move a little above, we'll try to see the goal here is protection of natural ecosystems, right? So what I have done is I've reproduced the graph as it was given in the paper itself. So there may be some typological issues, but I have just quoted the same source as the source for this figure. We'll be able to understand. So protection of natural ecosystems is the goal. So the indicators here are number of plants and animals which are threatened by extinction. And second is share of surface which is not closed for seeping rain. So here you see there are two diverse set of indicators that are considered here, but they are assessing actually the direct environmental impacts. But do we have what these indicators imply is, do we need to get data on the number of plants and animals which are threatened by extinction? Here you see we need to have a field experiment in place, and we need to have a strategy to collect the number of document first and collect the number of plants and animals which are facing extinction. So we need a methodology in place or a framework in place. But the second indicator indicates that the share of surface which is not closed for seeping rain, which means that more of pervious space. Okay, what it means is the indicator is pervious space. So pervious space will be helpful in protection of natural ecosystem naturally, but it is an interventional indicator. So the indicator here gives us data on the interventional aspect with which we study sustainability. So here we see methodological as well as interventional. So if we move on to the example which is above, the goal here considered here is what is the great variety of different numbers of people living together in a society, right? So that actually we are classifying this as institutional, because institutional itself is more of a localized study of sustainability, but which will always have far-reaching and through time, temporally, if you say, also large scale of time. So here this spatial component and temporal component is coming into action. So if you see the indicators for this goal, number of common events that people attend together and number of mixed marriages. So these two societal aspects will give an idea of how institutionalized or how localized some communities are or how different they are. So that will impact the way in which they see protection, environmental protection measures. They will see how, the economy of the local economy of the place is managed or sanctioned. So these are if we need to study a goal which is very, very broad or diverse as this great variety of different people living together, how can you classify or measure living together as quantify? How can we quantify it? So it's more of a qualitative study. So the methodology here again is a little different from the quantitative methodology we were talking about earlier. And also we need to select the appropriate indicators to judge how the quality of this institutionalized community is behaving, right? So here the focus of the indicators is on having methodological component and how appropriate they are to judge the qualitative aspects. So if we see the one above, goal is to strengthen participation in some activity, right? So let us take, it can be some hearings on how environmental impact assessment is being done. So the indicators say can be what are the number of citizens hearings which are being conducted. So that gives a direct measure of how strong the participation is. Second is money paid for the hearings. Who pays this money, right? If it's an institutional setup where this is going to be, taken up into mainstream discussions or discourses on the impact assessment itself, who's paying for this, which means it indicates that there is a public or a private sector, involvement in this, and it is being institutionalized. It is not a random event. So here the practicality is very, very important for any useful activity to take towards sustainability. In this case, it is participation or stakeholder participation for sustainability. So here the indicators, two examples that are given, it can show how practical they are or not practical they are to strengthen participatory action or or to facilitate the public participatory activities here. So the other last one, if we see, the control of emissions and emissions, that is the goal, right? Here, the institutional part as well as the economic part merge together. So here we are looking at two indicators again. One is actually money paid by the city administration for controlling the emissions, and the money paid by the city administration for controlling emissions. Emissions is something which is left out and emissions which is coming in, right? So the indicators should consider both. What is the influx and if the efflux? So if we are looking at this particular indicator, it is a composite indicator. It does not say emissions or emissions specifically, but it is a composite indicator, which means there is a mass balance approach that is involved, and that mass balance approach should be replicable over different data sets. So our indicators, if we want to use this indicator, it means that it is a composite indicator and it has to be replicated over different units to measure how the emissions and emissions are being controlled, how well they are being controlled. So I have given you several examples here to understand how we link the concept of sustainability to how we measure it. So if we want to summarize all that we have discussed right now, an indicator first is a measurement which will help us to quantify and understand our complex world. Another example which will make it clear is the use of GDP as an indicator, gross domestic product. So before 1930 economic recession in the world, there was no GDP. GDP was not invented or it was not used as an indicator. But post 1930, the status of the different nations in the world changed drastically. So at an economic forum, it was decided, World Economic Forum, it was decided that GDP should be adopted as a indicator of how well the countries are performing by the, how wealthy the nations are, number one, and how poor the nations are, and how well they are actually performing on the trade front. So GDP is a classic example of a composite indicator that was used to simplify how the world looks like in the future. And it has been, thoroughly used over several centuries now, several decades now, sorry, to judge how the wealth of the nations change over time. So that is something that we can take forth. Here we see that summarizing all that we saw from the earlier examples, we can actually judge the indicators as being measurable, as being composite, as being accurate. So these are the three different ways in which the indicators can basically be judged. If we see, say, take the example of measurable component, first we should ask, is the indicator simple enough? Will it give data which is practical, and can data be qualitative or quantitative, and can it be replicated? So these are the considerations while we consider setting an indicator for sustainability, which can be a measurable indicator. If we look at the other part of it or other dimension of it, it is the composite nature of this indicator. So the very nature of the indicator should be so that it can be helpful for us to track multiple dimensions of sustainability for any particular goal or target that is fixed for the society. Second most important consideration is that it should be interventional at all these levels as well to some point. We have seen examples of how important it is to be methodological, interventional, and it has to be appropriate. It should also be robust, which means that it should being composite and being able to take multiple dimensions, it should be very robust in letting us know when the change happens. So that is also very important. The third aspect or the third dimension is for the indicator to be accurate. So the indicator should be reflective. It means that first it should show what is the existing condition, and it should also reflect on any lacuna or any lagging behind on attaining the goals at proper intervals and time. So it also has to be to certain extent intuitive, which means that we can connect this intuitively with other dimension that needs to be fixed, so that the indicator tells us that achieving the sustainability goal will be a reality. And hence it should also be appropriate to the society to which it is administered. So being accurate is a product of being reflective, intuitive, as well as appropriate. Apart from these three dimensions, it is very important for the indicators to be non-manipulative. It means that nobody should be able to manipulate it. Wherever it is applied, if it is applied in Asia, the same should be applicable in Africa or South America or North America, or wherever we apply the indicators, and to collect the same set of data sets. So also it should be inclusive. It means that it should not, particularly favor one section of the society over the other. May it be rich or poor, or it can be, gender wise, or it should be inclusive. So that is the idea behind having indicator. It has to be non-manipulative and it has to be inclusive. And hence, with all these dimensions in place, it should reflect how transformational, the goal can be for the society, and how futuristic scenarios can come out of using the data from these indicators. So it has to have a transformational component, and it also has to have a futuristic component. So with this example, I think we can cover actually the different aspects of sustainability, or the concepts of sustainability that we put forth, basically with respect to economics, ecology, culture, and politics. So the indicators, these are the broad fields through which the indicators can emerge from. Okay, so for example, if you take ecology, indicators of material and energy become very, very important. So as also the indicators of water and air quality, on the flora and faunal distributions, the habitat quality and the food availability, the place and the space, also the construction and the settlements, the quality of constructions and the quantity of constructions and the settlements. So that become a very important indicator of its connection to ecology. Finally, also how much a given community or a society produces as waste, and where it goes out as emissions. So these actually are very robust groups of indicators. The indicators will fall in these categories, which will help us to measure how well the ecology of a given place is maintained. Right. So this actually is a good representation that I got from the economic side. If you see, the production and resourcing, the exchange and transfer, accounting and regulation, very, very important data sets, consumption and use, labor and welfare, technology and infrastructure, wealth and distribution. So these categories, we can develop indicators from these categories, which cover actually these particular themes which are mentioned here. So those can be robust, those can be interventional, and those can be actually methodological also. So if you see the bottom two sections, that is politics and culture, we actually come more to the qualitative aspect of this. Okay, so if we see politics, the organization and the governance, how this is being done. So that is qualitative data set. Again, the law and justice can give both qualitative and quantitative data sets. Communication and movement, right? Representation and negotiation, security and accord, dialogue and reconciliation, ethics and accountability. So all these actually also give mixed data sets, qualitative and quantitative data sets, whereas this will lead to how well the organization and governance aspects are reflected upon in a society. So how well the politics dimension measures is a mixture of indicators from these themes. We can select mixture of indicators from these themes to reflect on that. Similarly, if we go to the culture aspect, engagement and identity, recreation and creativity, memory and projection, belief and meaning, gender and generations, inquiry and learning, health and well-being. All these except health and well-being can mostly provide us qualitative data sets, whereas health and well-being can give qualitative and quantitative data sets. So the indicators which are being framed should have the qualities of achieving the reflection of both the qualitative and the quantitative changes that are happening in the sphere of culture. So these four together, if you see, are actually covered in all the other SDG goals that we have talked about. There are 17 SDG goals as we have already discussed. In this particular table, you can see I have listed the number of targets and the number of indicators per theme of SDGs, right? So SDG 1 to SDG 17, the theme is given, the number of targets and indicators are mentioned here. So among all these, the 17th SDG has the maximum number of targets and the maximum number of indicators. If you see, it may not be the maximum number of indicators, but a very high number of indicators. The maximum number of indicators is present in SDG 3, that is 28. So there is actually a way to understand the interlinks between these SDG targets and indicators across SDGs itself. The basic idea of today's class is to help us to come to that point. We will be discussing this a little later, but if you can see that 19 targets have about 25 indicators, whereas SDG 3, if you see, 13 targets with 28 indicators. So here the indicator, you can take one that is the least. For example, SDG 7, if you see, there are 5 targets and 6 indicators, that is for clean energy. So if you can also see SDG 13, 5 targets and 8 indicators. There is actually a big workshop, a series of workshops which are conducted to arrive at the targets and indicators itself. It is a global effort which has taken considerable time for the global society to come up with these targets and indicators. But looking at these targets and indicators, what it appears to us is that there are several ways to form the indicators, as we have already seen. Some will be an interventional indicator, and some will require more direct approach, and some may have indirect approach. So we should understand that all the indicators here are not exactly representing everything that we want to measure in terms of sustainability. Although we have robust targets, the indicators may or may not need to evolve over time. So this is one understanding we should take forth. So now the exercise that we are going to do in the next about 1 hour is that we are going to go through each of these targets and indicators and try to understand what this SDG goal is going to talk to us about. So as we do this, usually in my class, I ask my students to classify these indicators as measurable, composite, accurate, inclusive, and transformational, right? So that M, C, A, I, and T. I can go back to the previous slide, this slide: measurable, composite, accurate, non-manipulative and inclusive, transformational, futuristic. So I would ask you also, as we go through the targets and indicators, to quickly note this down in your notes so that you will be able to make sense of how well these targets are placed. How well these indicators are placed to indicate the goals of these particular SDGs. Okay, so now we start with SDG 1. So SDG 1 deals with no poverty, which means that we are actually looking at some definitions of international and national poverty lines, global poverty rates, urban versus rural scenarios in terms of even the GDP of nations, the direct economic losses. Let us go one by one. So the targets mentioned here are 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.5. About 2030, the nature of these targets are to 1, eradicate extreme poverty, reduce by half the proportion of men, women, and children who are living in poverty. By 2030, also to achieve substantial social protection coverage for the poor and the vulnerable sections, to ensure that all men and women have equal rights to all the economic resources, the natural resources, ownership and control over land and other forms of the property, also to develop new technology and financial services. And 5 is to build the resilience of the poor. So these 5 targets with 2 developmental targets, A and B. A ensures should ensure, the target is to ensure significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources to end poverty. And 1B is to create sound policy frameworks at national, regional, and international levels. So now, since we have looked at these targets, 7 targets and 14 indicators, they actually look at how to build resilience from both societal, environmental, and economic aspects. Also, it means mobilization of resources. Now, if with this idea, if we look at the indicators, okay, the first indicator is proportion of population which is living below the international poverty line. So how we are going to judge how much of the the target that we have set to achieve by 2030? If you see here, the 2030 is to eradicate extreme poverty. So the indicator here says proportion of the population which is now living below the international poverty line. So it takes a lot of discussion on what we call international poverty line and national poverty line, but I'm not going to go into this. We are looking at this from the indicator aspects, and we will go deeply into discussing these indicators in subsequent sessions. But also when we look at policy aspects, we will come back to this. But the indicator here is, which is the proportion of population below the international and national poverty lines, which means that a person is getting marginally paid for his or her sustenance in national and international scenarios. And that is the poverty line. Okay, so the proportion of men, women, and children living in poverty in all its dimensions. So poverty has different dimensions as well. I'm again not going to go into discussing that just SDG 1 here, but what we are seeing here is from the indicator aspect, how well or methodological this can represent how we say end the achieve the goal of ending poverty. So once we have data on these 3 aspects, say, we should be able to look at how we can end poverty, because our data says, for example, 1.1.1 will say the population below the international poverty line is so this percent. So our strategy can be, our policy can be oriented towards decreasing that percentage to lower percentages. So that is how the policy aspect comes into play when we look at the indicator itself. So in these indicators are going to give us quantitative data. Similarly, if you see 1.3.1, it is the proportion of population which is covered by social protection floors or systems. So here the importance is from an individual perspective, we are going to how well the society is able to function together to end poverty. So the quantitative aspect is to suggest what is the societal role, right? So social protection systems and floors. Next indicator, if you see, proportion of population which are living in households with access to basic services. So that is another dimension of poverty, right? So the person can be, healthy and they may be able to get some wages, but how, what is the percentage of population which is living in household which do not have access to basic services? So that is also another very important indicator. Another indicator is to see what is the percentage or proportion of adult population which have rights to land, which means that there are several aspects to this. One aspect is how well migration is linked to poverty as well. So if land ownership or rights are evident in one place, there is a chance that the area itself will have less poor people living in that area, who because they are able to have resources through which they can gain incomes and employment. So that is one indicator. Similarly, 1.5.1, which connects the natural dimension to the society, that is actually those are the number of deaths, missing persons, and persons affected by disaster per 1 lakh people, which is going to turn one section of the population into poor population, right? It's going to put some sections which are affected or impacted by disasters into poor population. So that is one very important robust indicator. Sometimes we see that it is not connected to what we are talking to. It might look like that, right? But that's why I said the concept of direct and indirect indicators come forth here. So this indicator is indirect indicator of what we can expect the impacts or the economic impacts for a certain section of population which is affected by disasters. Second is a direct indicator, how direct disaster economic loss is related to the global GDP, right? Third is the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, which will result in low poverty lines over the future. Okay, so these are actually two very direct indicators. If we see for the developmental SDGs, 1A1 relates to the proportion of resources allocated by the government directly to poverty reduction programs and the proportion of the total government spending on essential services such as education, health, and social protection. So these two indicators are very important, nationwide interventions, indicators of interventions which will bring down the poverty. So it is interventional. If you see, these two indicators are interventional. Also, the final, that is also an interventional aspect, is proportion of government, recurrent and capital spending to sectors that disproportionately benefit the women, the poor, and the vulnerable sections. So now we have an idea, looking at these indicators, how well we can judge that SDG 1, that is the poverty, is being implemented worldwide, nationwide, and society-wise, right? So now we are moving on to the second SDG, that is zero hunger. And this deals with food security. It's not just with food security. What is the income getting the people get from engaging in agriculture and food production? Also, how malnutrition is a very big dimension of this SDG, and how resilient agricultural practices and sustainable production practices can help in bringing down the hunger or achieve the zero hunger challenge, and also maintaining in that aspect. It's not just having enough food produced or having the food security, but also managing the genetic diversity, which will help futuristic community to achieve the same target, and also to stabilize food commodity markets. So from this we know that we associate food security with hunger and the person's reasons for going through hunger, and these actually form the basis for setting the various indicators for achieving this goal of zero hunger. So target number 2.1, if you see, the target is universal access to safe and nutritious food. That is the target we are going to achieve. For that, the indicators that we are taking are prevalence of undernourishment and prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. So these two aspects. If you see undernourishment, it is a very individualistic measure. But if you see food security, food insecurity in the population, it is based on a previously developed scale, which is known as the food insecurity experience scale. I'll talk about this a little elaborate in some coming sessions, but we have to understand that this scale actually puts each country on a scale. It marks it on how food insecurity is affecting its populations. So using this scale, we develop an indicator to determine if the FIES scale, according to the scale, the food insecurity is moderate or severe. That is what the indicator says. So moving on to target 2.2, you see, the 2.2 target is to end all forms of malnutrition. And here the indicators, we have three indicators. First one is prevalence of stunting. That is the height for age, which is less than -2 standard deviation from the median height, or which is prescribed by the World Health Organization as per the child growth standards. And this is actually an indicator, a quantitative measure among children under 5 years of age. So how does stunting relate to malnutrition? It is a direct reflection of malnutrition, right? So here, stunting amongst many other indicators is taken as one of the most important indicators to judge malnutrition. Similarly, you can see that the prevalence of malnutrition itself by in children by age, by type. Actually, there are two different types of malnutrition: wasting malnutrition and overweight. Being overweight is also an indicator of malnutrition. So this indicator is very robust if you consider, because it gives exact, it nails how we determine where malnutrition is present. So it's a very, very robust indicator. Similarly, another very robust indicator is detecting the prevalence of anemia in women aged 15 to 49 years, which is the reproductive age for women, and by pregnancy status. Okay, so this is another very, very direct indicator. Now, if we see target 2.3, double the productivity and incomes of small scale food producers. So if you see indicator 2.3.1, it should give us the data on volume of production per labor unit by classes of farming, pastoral, forestry, enterprise size. So what it means is, among these three enterprises, farming, pastoral, and forestry, according to their size, what is the volume of production per labor unit? So that is an indicator to see if we can double the productivity. So it's going to give us some data. With that data, we want to have some interventional aspect. So this is not an interventional aspect. This is a methodological indicator, which is just, telling us that how we can double what are the ways in which we can, target doubling the productivity. Second indicator is average income of small scale food producers by sex and indigenous status. So this is another very important thing. We were talking about appropriate to particular society or groups of people. So the indigenous status here becomes very important, right? So it is not just, we are judging in terms of a global income level, but this is also in terms of small scale food producers, where the productivity of land is not uniform across all the globe. It is different. And different varieties of crops are grown in different regions. So based on the small scale food producers output, we are trying to judge their average income and how we can double it. So here you see that this is also a robust replicatable measure, right, by indigenous communities. That is confined to some indigenous communities. So it's a very, very appropriate indicator. So finally, the target 2.4 here in this slide shows sustainable food production and resilient agricultural practices. That is the target. And the indicator for this target, what is the proportion of agricultural area under productive and sustainable agriculture? Very direct measure, right? So we have direct data. If we say target 2.5, maintain the genetic diversity in food production, two indicators we have: number of plant and animal genetic resources for food and agriculture secured in either medium or long-term conservational facilities. So it's very important. So is there any institutional framework which will help us to maintain genetic diversity? That is what this indicator 2.5.1 helps us to judge, right? So here the interventional aspect is being judged. So indicator 2.5.2 is proportion of local breeds classified as being at risk of extinction. So this is actually a practicable indicator which will help us to classify the local breeds which are at risk of extinction, so that some intervention can be targeted. Next, if you see target 2A, which is a developmental target, ABC are three developmental targets. The first one is invest in rural infrastructure, agricultural research, technology, and gene banks, right? So indicator 2.A1 talks about the agricultural orientation index, which is a preformed index for government expenditures. So this is a national level index, okay? So how well the government expenditure is oriented towards effective agriculture. That is what is this index, agriculture orientation index talks about. Second indicator are the total official flows. Here, official development assistance plus other official flows to the agricultural sector. So how well the government is spending on the agricultural sector, that is what this indicator reveals. So if we see 2B, the target is to prevent agricultural trade restrictions, market distortions, and export subsidies. And indicator 2B1, agricultural export subsidies, it's a direct indicator. 2C, if you see, ensure stable food commodity markets and timely access to information. Here, the indicator is the food price anomalies, how they are changing over time. So here, this is also a direct indicator. So here we've seen the different indicators, the targets versus the indicators for SDG 2. If we see some statistics related to this, I'm going to be very brief on this. The statistics show that the data from these indicators, okay, so these are actually studied in detail, and from this data collected by the indicators, we see that 811 million people go to bed hungry each night. Small farmers produce about 70% of global food supply, and conflict is the cause and consequence of hunger. So this is a qualitative aspect that has come out from these indicators. In 2020, the primary driver for hunger was termed as conflicts. It can be societal, it can be national, or it can be international, which was the cause for hunger for about 99 million people in about 23 countries, right? An estimated 14 million children under the age of 5 are malnutrition. Malnourished rather, and they suffer from acute malnutrition, which is also known as severe wasting. So it has indicator have been robust enough to differentiate between wasting and overweight, as I already pointed out. So now we have an estimated 14 million children, which is who are under the age of 5 and who are severely malnourished. And most important thing is there is more than enough food produced in the world to feed everyone on the planet. So the problem, the indicator that has shown us this, it has done a very good job to tell us that there is no scarcity of food. It is only the problem with distribution of food, right? The problem for us to manage through policy intervention is for distributing food so that nobody goes hungry. So if you can see that this case study that I've presented before you, how the indicators and targets for SDG 2 have done their job, it is pretty good. We have got very good insights from collecting data on these indicators, right? First thing that has shown us how many people are hungry. Second thing, it has shown that small scale farmers, their roles are very, very important. Third is that what is the cause for hunger? We have been able to find out. We have been able to find out how much children in the world are malnourished and why this happens, right? So it is a set of robust and a good set of indicators that have been developed for SDG 2. Then the global scenario, if you see, the distribution of food is very, very, uneven. And because of that, we are also seeing that access to food has also been different, which has resulted in undernourishment in adults also. So actually they have a habitual energy intake lower than their requirements. So here you can see in India was classified between the 10 to 20% category, but in recent years, we have actually come down towards 2018. If you see, we have come below the 15% of share of population, that is our population, which is undernourished. So there has been a lot of developmental changes, and this particular set of indicators tells us that our country's performance has also been very good in this aspect. So we can see that poverty and hunger, in case of assessment, we can say poverty and hunger are affecting the rural populations higher in more ways. And also the need to focus for us is on the rural aspect or rural poverty rather than urban poverty. So poverty is present everywhere. As I said, there are many forms of poverty. Rural and urban poverty is one form. So that category, under that category, our focus, our data shows that the rural poverty is higher. And doubling the small scale producers' incomes and productivity will help us achieve the target to reduce rural poverty. So this is what this set of targets and indicators have revealed to us. Now, with this understanding, we are quickly going to move on with other SDGs. I'm not going to go into detail as I have done for SDGs 1 and 2 for the rest of the SDGs, but we will discuss these indicators. Now is your chance again, as I told you, to classify, make notes as you see these targets. For each target, I'm going to show the indicator. See how robust it's interventional, measurable, accurate, composite, interventional, and also transformational, as well as futuristic these goals are, apart from being non-manipulative and inclusive, right? So the non-manipulative part is very, very important from SDG 3 onwards, because many countries can also give in data which show otherwise, that they are actually trying to conform to SDGs where they might not be doing that. This happens basically when there are qualitative aspects involved. So let us go into SDG 3. So SDG 3 has 13 targets and 28 indicators, as we discussed, one of the highest sets of targets and indicators. 3.1, if you see, is the target is to reduce maternal mortality. So for that, we have very well-defined measures, maternal mortality ratio and skilled birth attendance as our indicators. These are direct indicators of the the place where maternal mortality is higher in the world and lower in the world. It can be applied to all places in the world similarly, right, on the same front. And it's a very simple set of indicators. Next is target 3.2 says end all preventable deaths under age of 5. So this has two indicators again. What is the under 5 mortality ratio that is existing, and what is the existing neonatal mortality ratio? So now it makes a difference. Earlier, actually, if we have had some policy lacunae, right, we cannot just stop. If you say you have to connect this with child malnourishment data that we came about in the last SDG, which says we should connect this mortality rate with that undernourishment or malnourishment rate, right? Then it makes a sense to develop policies which can target the reduction in malnourishment and see if that is what is causing the mortality. Otherwise, there can be other aspects. It can be through disease or it can be through other aspects that we have to see as we move on. So here you see there is a small link you can see already between SDGs 2 and 3. If we see target 3.3, fight communicable diseases. So these sets of indicators are very direct. If you see indicator 3.3.1 to 3.3.5, they're very direct indicators. One talks about HIV infections per 1,000 unaffected population. Next is tuberculosis incidence. Next is malaria incidence. The next indicator is judging the hepatitis B incidence. And the last one, 3.3.5, is the indicator which talks about the number of people who require the interventions against even neglected tropical diseases. So the whole set of indicators here, 3.3.1 to 3.3.5, they cover all the aspects of communicable disease, right? So the data on the aspects of communicable disease which lead to low health and high mortality. So that is covered in these indicators. So if we say target 3.4, reduce mortality from non-communicable disease. Earlier we saw 3.3 is dealing with communicable. Now we are going to non-communicable disease as well as mental health promotion. Two sets of indicators are only considered in this. One is the mortality rate, which is attributed to cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, or chronic respiratory disease. Now we have come to a very important place in our discussion on the indicators. If we see, we brought in the concept of futuristic, right? So if we see, we have devoted so many indicators for target 3.3 to communicable disease at a time where the incidence of death from communicable disease was very high. But now if you see, with the progress of the human society, the diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory disease, these contribute to more number of deaths. But we have only one composite indicator which judges what is the mortality rate associated combined in a combination of all these diseases together. So do we think it is adequate? So there are actually discourses going around in the world which says we should have more robust set of indicators or sub-indicators amongst these indicators to judge the actual contributions of each of these diseases and to quantify their nature and their contribution to overall mortality, so that more better interventional policies can be developed to assure good health. Right. So this is where the futuristic component becomes very important. The indicator should also be futuristic, and it should consider. So for example, if in a decade later, we may come across a disease which was totally absent earlier. One example, now we are going through COVID-19 is not even mentioned in this, right? The pandemic is not even mentioned in this set of indicators, but it can emerge. New diseases will always emerge. So here, we need to also account for that. Suppose we had an indicator 3.4.3, which said that what is the mortality rate due to new diseases, that would come under this, right? So the interventional aspects or the pulling power according to policies will be concentrated on that very indicator across the globe. Now we don't have that. That is an obvious lacuna, right? So indicator 3.4.2 determines the suicide mortality rate, which is also under rise in the near future, in the near recent past, and it's going to increase. That's what is projected in the near future. But how do interventions help to reduce this? So that is where more of science and more of medical science is directed towards. So that is a very robust indicator which is very adequately used to judge the target, right? Second, 3.5, if you see, prevent and treat substance abuse. This is also a very futuristically determined target, which has two sets of indicators. One is coverage of treatment interventions, which include pharmacological, psychosocial, and rehabilitation, as well as aftercare services for substance use disorders. If we have such data for our country, it is very, very important for every country now, since it has been determined as an SDG indicator, to provide data for these subcategories. Otherwise, there is a chance that in many of the poor countries or developing, least developed countries, there is no way or no framework that they are thinking, which can, even think about what are the treatment interventions that are required among the populations who are affected by substance abuse, right? So also, another indicator, alcohol consumption per capita, is a very, very direct indicator. So these are very robust indicators. Now, another indicator, which is very, very surprisingly very futuristic, is reduce road injuries and deaths. It might at one point of time, it might have felt like why people are having this as one of the targets, because the incidence of road injuries must have been less at that point in time. But now, because of the rise in population and because of the number of rise in vehicles, the road injuries and deaths have also increased. So the indicator should say give data on half the number of road traffic deaths per country in monthly and annual terms. So if you say 3.7, universal access to sexual and reproductive care, family planning, and education. This has two indicators. Again, this is connected to SDGs 1 and 2 very closely. Proportion of women of reproductive age who have the need for family planning, and also the adolescent birth rate. So this will quantify, actually link to maternal mortality rates and neonatal mortality rates as well, as we have seen. So now these are very robust set of direct indicators again. If we see 3.8, achieve universal health coverage. So these are also very direct indicators, coverage of essential health services and household expenditures on health. Okay, so here, very interestingly, 3.8.2 brings down the indicator level to a very local or individual level scale, household expenditures on health per country. So when we say per country, the countrywide census should take into account district-wise, local-wise, village-wise, right? Ward-wise. So we have such high resolution data, if you can see, for indicator 3.8.2, which can come up and indicate how well universal health coverage has been effected. Finally, target 3.9, reduce illnesses and deaths from hazardous chemicals and pollution. This is also a very, very important and a growing concern. And mortality rate from air pollution as a separate indicator is a very, very important measure. So as the mortality rate from unsafe water, sanitation and hygiene, also the mortality rate attributed to unintentional poisoning. Okay, so these are very, very robust set of indicators which can actually help us to develop policies or interventional policies to target 3.9. So if we see the developmental targets here, A, B, C, and D, implement the WHO framework convention on tobacco control, right? So the prevalence of tobacco use. So now we need data on prevalence of tobacco use, which indicator 3.81 will give us. Then target 3B, if you see, support research, development, and universal access to affordable vaccines and medicines. So this is also a very important issue. And vaccine coverage, developmental assistance to medical and research basic healthcare, and availability of essential medicines. These three can be suitable SDG indicators. So just earlier, we had a short discussion on how the pandemic discourse has been neglected largely, which has not been futuristically involved. But if we take that in terms of target 3B, although it is at a nationwide level or a global level, it is not a regional or even a national subnational level, it is more of a national level. Still, the indicators on vaccine coverage, developmental assistance or spending on healthcare, as well as availability of medicines, these three are very good ways to judge this, right? So whatever futuristic issues, medical issues come, this target 3B will be a crucial way to achieve sustainability in terms of good health and well-being. Target 3C, we see increase health financing and support the health workforce in developing countries. This is specifically for developing countries alone. So it's a very, very robust target. And the indicator is also a very direct way to judge this. What is the density of health workers per region, right? So that is a very good indicator. Target 3D, we see improve early warning systems for global health risks. So this is also a very direct indicator how well the health emergency preparedness of each nation is in force. So now we've seen the different targets and indicators. These have been very extensive sets of targets and indicators, but there is always space for new visions based on how the society is evolving and what is the status of the society with respect to health concerns. Now moving on to quality education, we can see that the overall goal is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities. So with that overarching idea, the targets are also fixed appropriately, I would say. I'm not going to discuss all the targets in detail, but this is something that we can understand very well ourselves. If we see target 4.1, it is to ensure, despite the gender, the right of the girls and boys to complete free, equitable, and quality education at primary, secondary levels, and also leading to effective outcomes. So here, the indicators are very important. What is the proportion of children and the young people in grades 2 and 3? So mostly it is why grades 2 and 3 are taken up for indication is that many children will start school, but they have to continue school. If they are in 2 and 3, the higher proportion is there. It means that they are actually progressing through education well in the primary level. So this indicator judges at primary, lower secondary, as well as it also judges by the reading, that is literacy and computing, reading and mathematics. Okay, what is their proficiency? So that is a very good set of indicator to achieve by 2030 what we have set to achieve, that is equitable education. Indicator 4.1.2 deals with completion rate. So it's not just the starting rate as we saw, but also the completion rate at different levels again. Target 4.2, it actually deals with early childhood development. So whenever I look at these targets 4.1 and 2, it strikes me that 4.2 should be 4.1 and 4.1 should be 4.2, because it should start from the pre-primary level and go down to primary and secondary level, or go up primary and secondary level. But anyways, the target 4.2 here deals with pre-primary education, where the children in the age 24 to 59 months are actually put into some sort of organized educational facilities, so that they are actually starting off on the right track in about learning and their psychosocial well-being, right? So the participation in organized learning, these are the two indicators, 4.2.1 and 4.2.2. So this is actually a very robust set of indicators again. 4.3, if we see, ensures the target is to ensure equal access for all women and children to tertiary, technical, vocational education, including university level education. So here the participation rate of youths and adults in formal and non-formal education are taken as indicator. It is a very robust indicator, but it's actually also a time-based indicator. It says for the last 12 months or 1 year only by the gender, right? So it's a very time-based approach, which needs faster data evolution over time and faster analysis of these data sets, right? So it's a high resolution data again, or the indicator will lead to collection of high resolution data. Target 4.4 is to increase the number of youth with relevant skills, both technical and vocational, and also find which will lead to their employment. This actually connects to the SDG 1 target that we have been seeing. Also, we have been looking at many of the SDG 2 targets with increased, less poverty line, which means increased income. It means there are skill development happening, which has resulted in employment. Okay, so these are interconnected again. Here you can see the proportion of youth and adults which have access or which have gotten the skills for information and technology, in communication technology, ICT skills. By the type of skill, it can lead to better employability. That is the indicator. Again, a very robust indicator. Target 4.5 deals with eliminating gender disparities. So here, the indicator, how will we judge that gender disparity is eliminated? It looks like a qualitative issue for us, right? But it is a mixed data that we require to judge this, because we can develop what are known as parity indices. Parity indices are the female to male, rural, urban, bottom, top wealth quantiles, which are also classified according to their disability statuses, also indigenous people statuses, and conflict affecting statuses, which will lead to less gender disparity in education. So this is again connected with the conflict scenario of SDG 2 that we were talking about. So parity indices, how well both females and males are able to find employment through education. Okay, so that's a very, very important index, actually a very composite index, measurable, composite, and very transformational index. But the problem is that it should be non-manipulative. It should be maintained as non-manipulative. So that is a very, very important consideration with respect to 4.5.1. If we see 4.6 target, the target is to ensure that all youth and a substantial proportion of adults achieve literacy and numeracy, which we already have talked about in terms of reading and mathematics in the target 4.1. So this is for adults now. So similarly, the proportion of population in the adult age group, which has achieved a fixed level of proficiency in terms of literacy and numeracy skills. So this is a very good indicator, which we can, compare between targets 4.1 and 4.6. So even within SDGs, these targets are interlinked. The performance of 4.1 can guarantee or may not guarantee achieving the target of 4.6. So it is a very interesting way to look at things. So if a country is spending more on primary and secondary education, but less on tertiary and vocational and skill-based education, there will be a mismatch between achieving targets 4.1 and 4.6. So it's a very good set of indicators, 4.1 and 4.6.1, which can actually indicate how well a country is spending on different levels of education. Similarly, 4.7, if you see, is how well the education leads to achieving sustainable lifestyles. So it's a very, very, very crucial target which connects or interconnects to every other target. So education, SDG 4 itself is considered a set of very, very important targets because every other SDG goals are associated with achieving the different targets, 10 different targets of SDG 4. Here, how well promoting culture of peace, culture of non-violence, having gender rights, respecting human rights, and having an appreciation of the biodiversity will lead to having sustainable lifestyles. So I would say this is a very complex target also. If we see 4.7.1, the indicator here is very interesting. See, the indicator says it is the extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development are mainstreamed. So we in the PGDSS program are contributing positively to this very indicator, right? So how many programs are there in a nation which will contribute to sustainable lifestyle, which will result in sustainable lifestyle? Also, how they are mainstreamed through education policies, through curricula, through teacher education and student assessment. So this is a very, very robust indicator you can see, and a very good example of a composite, robust, also very transformational. It's a unique example of a transformational indicator. Now we have three different developmental indicators for SDG 4. First, target 4A, build and upgrade the educational infrastructure. So that we have a safe working and learning environment, effective, inclusive. Okay, inclusive is also very important, learning environment for all. So the indicator is proportion of schools offering basic services. Okay, so it's a very direct indicator of how the infrastructure development should proceed. If we see 4B, which deals with the number of scholarship which is given to developing countries, it is again the indicator here, what is the volume of official development assistance flows for scholarships by sector and type of study. It's a very direct indicator of how the progression in education is happening countrywide. The developmental target 4.3 is to increase the supply of qualified teachers. So teacher training, that is the focus of 4C. And the indicator is also very, very effective here. Proportion of teachers with the minimum required qualification by educational level to teach the particular classes. So here we see the SDG targets and indicators are well matched for SDG 4. But the view is that what we get from having this data from these indicators show that the frames of reference to how well these targets are met are clustered around three pillars: power, knowledge, and norms. And these are actually proximate drivers of how governance, especially technology, demographics, and institutions function within a given area or a region. Also, it has shown us that some problems will arise due to terminological subtlety. So, for example, there is we have formal education which we are aware of. There is a formal facility called school where the children go to. There is a common curriculum. It can be a different types of curriculum adopted all over the world, but it's standardized, right? We go from, for example, if it's a reading skill, we go from the basics of teaching the alphabets to formation of words to formation of sentences and reading. So this is one way in which children are approached for developing their learning capacity. Similarly, computational. So we have this formalized, standardized environments. We also have non-formal environments. Montessori education is a non-formalized type of education that is prevalent, where the children learn inherently by themselves when they want to. So, but the frame of judging how well children in non-formal versus formal education, how well they are functioning is different. It is very difficult for us to say that X child, which is going to a Montessori education system, is lesser in capacity or higher maybe in compared to Y child, which is going to a formalized, standardized system of education, say Western education. So here, there are different levels of abstraction and different terminological references which make the judging of SDGs little difficult, although non-formal versus formal are included within the discourse, larger discourse of the the SDG goals itself. Also, innovation and challenges are very important, and knowledge and training challenges, like, for example, we have the National Digital University model, which is coming up in India, and IGNOU is a forerunner in this model. This is going to determine how well, advanced level education is coming up in the country. So here, now moving on to SDG 5. If we see, SDG 5 deals with actually, gender issues in largely, broadly, but target 5.1, if you see, end discrimination against women and girls, that deals with legal frameworks. Indicator is legal frameworks. It's a very straightforward indicator. Then if we see 5.2, which says end violence against and exploitation of women and girls. So two indicators are there. One is actually violence against women from an intimate partner and a person other than intimate partner. So it's a very good way to judge where the violence against women and girls are perpetrated. So that's a very good set of indicators. If we see 5.3, eliminate forced marriages and genital mutilation. Again, we have two sets of indicators, which are very, very direct indicators, like women married before 15 and 18, and the female mutilation or cutting. So this is actually, you can also call this a phenomenon which is localized to certain sections of the world. It's not prevalent in all societies, but it is a very good way to judge where this is happening and find out the cause for it. So it is a very, very interventional indicator also. 5.4, if we say, it takes a different dimension of how well the domestic responsibility are shared and what is the time spent by women on and men on unpaid domestic work and care work. Okay, that is a very good and a very robust indicator, which is very, very modern, as well as which is very relevant in the current times. And 5.5, we say, ensure full participation in leadership and decision making. Here, two indicators we are going to consider: women in political positions and women in managerial positions. These two indicators again give us an idea of participation and decision making, prevalent and specialized only for women. I showed an example of this, how well women leaders are present in India in the last class. So you can refer to those slides as well. Target 5.6 deals with universal access to reproductive rights. This is also connected to our SDG on good health and well-being. So there is an interconnection. Women in decision making on contraceptive use in healthcare, and equal access to reproductive and sexual healthcare. So these are very robust indicators. 3 developmental indicators, again, these are all direct indicators for target 5. Okay, so that is what I am highlighting here. Be it female land rights, equal rights to land ownership, mobile telephone ownership, and systems to track gender equality. So these are very direct sets of indicators which contribute to how well the targets of SDG 5 function. So if we say we can actually derive these such useful statistic using this set of indicators. For example, you can say in Southern Asia, the girls' risk of marrying in childhood has decreased by 40% since 2000. So the performance or conformance to SDG goals has brought down the, SDG goals came into being in 2015, but even before that, the awareness about decreasing the risk of childhood marriages has been very high. So these set of indicators tell us or reflect, they are reflective indicators which tell us how the society has progressed over time. So as I'm not going to read out all these statistics, this is just to show that, for example, if we take 39% represent the workforce in the present time, but only 27% have managerial positions or decision-making positions within that. So these are clear indicators. These data have come from the data from those indicators. So also the data on work participation rates, the decline in free work participation among women, these are aspects which the indicators have brought to the forefront. Moving on to SDG 6, which deals with water. Okay, so the indicators again in SDG 6 are very, very direct. If you see the indicators alone, even by themselves, SDG 6 is a very, very well and explicitly stated set of indicators. What is the safe drinking water? What is the safe sanitation and hygiene? These are levels of safe drinking water, safe sanitation and hygiene, ambient water quality, water use efficiency, levels of freshwater stress, integrated water management approaches, transboundary water cooperation approaches, protection and restoring water related ecosystems, water and sanitation support systems in the country, local participation in sanitation management. So these sets of goals and indicators, if you have seen, there are only two developmental targets, A and B here. Even those developmental targets are well stressed upon. So if you see, when we are seeing safe drinking water, safe sanitation, and also water use efficiency, these are actually interlinked, as you already know. Here you can see they are also linked specifically within the goals itself to local participation as well as the government support or the public sector support for ensuring safe water and sanitation. So here you can see that protection and restoration of water related ecosystems comes at the last among all the 6 other targets, apart from the 8 last 2 targets, leaving those. So here you can see that the push for water related ecosystems, although when it's an indicator in 6.6.1, it actually pervades the rest of the targets, right? So achieving those targets will give favorable inputs to for data on 6.6.1 as well. So moving on, we can, these sets of indicators have critically examined the way in which safe water and clean water and sanitation is available for society. In 2020, for example, you can see that only 26% lack safely managed drinking water, which amounts to 2 billion people. So it's a positive, a statistic, I would say, which gives us an interventional insight into how well some schemes related to assuring safe water have on the globe managed to bring down the percentage of people who do not have access to safe water. Also, if you see 129 countries are not on track to have sustainably managed water resources by 2030. That is another insight that has come. Although the fair share of safe water has increased, there are other sustainability goals which are not being met, which can increase the way in which water resources are managed sustainably over long periods in time. That has not yet been reached. So which means that there is loss of water and loss of water ecosystem, degradation of water ecosystem, which is very, very rampant. We'll talk more about SDG 6 in particular in the chapter on water and water related ecosystems. So I'm just going to, I'm just highlighting here that the runoff, even from the ecosystem perspective, if you see 4% of global runoff of rivers is happening, especially in India. When we come from global scenario to Indian scenario, 18% of the world's population actually has the access, but only 4% of average global runoff is happening for river ecosystem itself. Okay, so that 4% is a loss that some people see it as a loss. Some people, look at it as a natural watershed process, but it can be supplemented through other processes such as freshwater recovery and freshwater reuse. So how this can be, these statistics show us that there are actually lacunae, but interventionally we can approach these issues. Okay, so these are some examples from how the data has come from these indicators. Moving on to SDG 7, it is one of the easiest number of sets of targets and indicators, and it is also straightforward. For example, indicators like access to electricity, access to clean fuels, what is the renewable energy percentage that is being used, right? What is the energy efficiency that we have? What is the access and investments in the clean energy sector? What is the expanding energy services for developing countries? So these are actually the robust set of indicators which have given very wide coverage to the global energy crisis and the global energy scenario. So if you see here, increasing the percentage of renewable energy and promoting clean energy, those are actually the top highlights among these targets. And these indicators are very well placed to for us to determined this very successfully. Here we see that 9 out of 10 people have access to electricity, which is actually a derivative from the indicator. The data tells us that 3 million people lack clean cooking fuels. That is also shown from the set of indicators. So now we know where our policy should be targeted to increase clean fuels and also put on track the number of people who have access to clean fuels. So here, if we go on to SDG 8, again, the sets of indicators here are very, very direct. As I told you about GDP per capita per growth rate is a direct indicator of achieving sustainable economic growth. So here we having from this data, we can tell how sustainably economic growth is happening. Per employed person, we have an indicator which is which discusses per employed person what is the share of GDP. So this requires a little discussion. It might not be very apparent to you at this particular time, but it is what I'm trying to say is that we have the GDP idea already in place, and the indicator utilizes the concept of GDP to come up with discourses or narratives and judging on the sustainable economic growth patterns itself, because we have long-term data. So the time aspect of it, the temporal aspect of having GDP gives us a wide coverage of temporality to judge whether the economic growth has been sustainable over a period of time, and also where there is need to diversify and innovate. Also targets indicators such as informal employment, what is the material footprint, what is the material consumption in domestic circles, what is the hourly earnings of the workforce, and what is the unemployment rate, the youth employment and education training rates, child labor rates, occupational injuries, compliance with labor rights. So these are all very direct sets of indicators which are mostly mixed, both qualitative and quantitative, along with actually linking it to other aspects which are mostly transformational or futuristic. For example, the tourism contribution to GDP, growing access to financial services, a population which have a financial account to manage their finances, what is the aid which is given per country for trade, what is the increasing aid for trade support, and the youth employment strategy for every nation. So these are very direct set of indicators which help us to judge where the decent economic growth, how well this is happening as per the goals of SDG 8. Now, if we see, these have resulted in very good statistics for us. Again, we have come up with globally, there is 172 million who are unemployed, and also 24% declining female labor rate, participation rate. This we can link to both the gender parity, the discussions that we have had on the lifestyle, the education, and the gender parity, right? Here, if we move on, this SDG 9, which is specifically tailored to industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Again, the indicators are very, very direct. I hope you're able to hear me. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I was telling that the set of SDG 9 indicators are again very direct. What is the road access for rural populations? What are the passenger and freight volumes? What is the manufacturing value for regions and the nations? What is the manufacturing employment rate? Only in the manufacturing sector. This is very specific to manufacturing sector. The value of small scale industries and the small scale industries with affordable credit. So these are all very direct, indicators which actually lead to promotion of inclusive and sustainable industrialization options. Now, if we see target 9.4, it is very interesting. Here, actually, the concept of CO2 emissions is added as indicator to determine whether industry, innovation, and infrastructure is concentrating on developing sustainable and resilient infrastructures. Here, the indicator 9.4.1 is very important. CO2 emissions per unit value added. We had a discussion on man-made capital versus natural capital. This is a very good way to associate it with that concept of sustainability, whether it's a weak sustainability concept or a strong sustainability concept. Also, the targets for 9.5 to 9A, B, C, these are also actually direct, but it actually is a composite set of indicators, mostly at national levels. For example, if you can see what is the research and development spending per nation, how many researchers are there per million inhabitants, also the developmental assistance given for including the sustainable infrastructure for developing countries, what is the medium and high-tech industry component in terms of industrial diversification per nation, and also the developmental assistance for improving the ICT access. So these are actually direct sets of indicators. Here we can see that the focus of these indicators, especially in terms of pandemic, has been very, very critical, because it has shown us exactly where industrialization in terms of infrastructure development, manufacturing processes, and R&D has been placed in the situation, especially in terms of the global pandemic. So this chart, if you can, take, I'm going to also share these slides with you. If you can take a good look, it shows how catastrophic 2020 has been for the industrial growth and infrastructure development, which means more of policies should come up here to build resilient infrastructure and sustainable industrialization in future. So if we take SDG 10, again here, it is a very direct set of indicators like income growth inequalities, people living below 50% of median income, which also combines to the SDG targets and indicators of SDG 1. Ensure equal opportunities by eliminating discriminatory practice. That is the indicator. This is actually a very important qualitative indicator, how well the practices in the society are helpful to eliminate discriminatory practices. And it is also a reflection of the institutional mechanisms which help in promoting indicators like policies for greater equality, regulating financial markets, improving voting rights, reducing migration recruitment costs, increasing the migration policies to well-enhanced levels, especially in developed countries and developing countries, and deaths and disappearances during migration relating to also the hunger and poverty SDGs, and the refugee population, again with reference to 1, 2, and 3 SDGs. So here, these are all very direct set of indicators, we can say, which can, give very robust discussions. A, B, and C again are the developmental indicators. Indicators like differential tariffs for the least developed countries, developmental assistance and investment in least development countries, and transaction costs for migrant remittances. So actually these, how much the transaction costs are there through investing on rehabilitating migrant populations. These are all go into determining how well the SDG 10 targets of reduced inequalities are being achieved. So here again, this the pandemic influences is very, very reflective from these sets of indicators. I request you to go through this. So the further progress actually is in terms of the increase in the migratory routes. We know that several cases are there where populations, illegal migrants have perished on their way moving from one country to another country. Recent times we have come up with many such stories. So in the background of such happenings during the pandemic time itself, these sets of indicators become very, very essential for us to judge how the society is progressing in terms of the migrant populations. Otherwise, it's very difficult to indicate and very difficult to track, right? So this leads to SDG 11, which deals with sustainable cities and communities. Again, the sets of indicators here are very, very robust. What is the urban population living in slums? What is the transportation access, public transportation access that is available to the citizens in the cities? What are the sustainable urbanization rates? What is the management, urban planning management rate? And the protection of cultural heritage. So these, see, although they are very diversified indicators, they are very well linked to each other to represent whether the city is being sustainable or not. Also, the rest of the indicators like deaths and injuries from natural disasters, economic losses from natural disasters. This is very, very important set of indicators. As in also solid waste management approaches and urban air pollution rates. Also, the number of open spaces available in the cities and the distinction between open and safe spaces. So this is actually very important to provide safe and inclusive spaces, which actually promote green infrastructure in cities. Now, if we see the developmental targets, what is the urban and regional planning plans that are available, and what are the economic losses from natural disasters? Now, see, actually, this is getting, repeated from the previous, but you can see that it is also actually leading to developmental planning, right? So also the integrated disaster risk management approach and local disaster risk management approach, these are interconnected to the losses from natural disasters. That's why I've highlighted it here. So we have to understand it from that perspective. And also in terms of least developed countries, how well sustainable and resilient building infrastructures are available. So that is an indicator. Going on from that, again, national urban policies and policies on slum development, this has taken the front stage from the set of data that the indicators have contributed on SDG 11. So also the push for increasing the urban green spaces, that has also come because the average global urban area, you can say 16% is being allotted to streets and open public spaces, which is a very good development, right? But it is running short of the target of 30%. So this actually is a very good insight from the set of indicators that we have come up. Also, for example, 9 out of 10 urban residents breathe polluted air. This is a very alarming negative aspect that has come about, and it requires immediate policy interventions to reduce air pollution. So the set of indicators have contributed to these findings. If we see 12, I think we have already gone short of, we shot forward 10 minutes from 1. Dr. Khuman, can I continue or should we take this to the next class? Okay, so since I've not received any answer, let me just continue this. I'll be very short. The indicators here again are repetitive in a way to the indicators that we have seen earlier, and they're also very direct, indicators. For example, sustainable consumption and production, material footprint, as we have already seen in another SDG. What is the consumption? Again, we have seen in another SDG. What is the food loss, which contribute to food insecurity from the previous SDG. Then the international agreements on the use of hazardous waste and hazardous waste generation itself. So these targets are very direct targets. Also the targets on indicators on recycling rates, companies publishing the reports. This actually ensures that there is non-discrimination and that there is a clear or a direct approach which is taken to the data which is generated from these indicators. There is no hiding of data. That companies publishing sustainability reports is a way to check that. So this is a very unique way in which indicators are used. National sustainable procurement plans is another very robust indicator, and understanding sustainable lifestyles, which also connect to the SDG 4 goals and 4 targets, right? Or especially 4.7. So these are actually the targets, main targets, and 3 developmental targets such as supporting developing countries' capacity for sustainable production, monitoring sustainable tourism, and removing fossil fuel subsidies. So these 3 indicators very well represent the developing countries and least developed countries in terms of where they are placed in terms of wasteful consumption, in terms of improving tourism, and in terms of improving their scientific and technological capacities. So I'm not going to go into this. Again, you can see that very good, robust indicators have contributed to robust data especially in terms of material footprinting, in terms of electronic wastes. And also, it also is an indicator of how well the global material footprint is rapidly growing, outpacing population and economic growth. So it is very, very important to understand these sets of indicators. If we see 13, SDG 13, which deals with climate change, very, very direct set of indicators like deaths and injuries from natural disasters, national disaster risk management approaches, which is also repetitive across other SDGs. What is the local disaster risk level management? So there is a distinction now made between national and local level approaches. Also, integration into national policies. That is a very, very important discourse. Indicator on climate change, how education is contributing to climate change capacity building and knowledge development, the Green Climate Fund mobilization, and support for planning in least developed countries. So these are the indicators which very crucially help us to assess the climate change scenario, which is very, very, you can see that they are very well placed and very well targeted to assess this. And the climate crisis, as per the data from these indicators, continues, although there is a climb towards carbon neutrality, but shift in economies is indicated. So this is something that is very important. As you can see that 125 out of 154 developing countries are formulating national climate adaptation plans, which is an outcome of these indicators. The study of this indicator also shows that more of climate finance investment is required in terms of reducing the dependency on fossil fuels. So if we see life below water, this is the least of the SDGs which are given priorities right now, but it is also one of the most important ones, as I told you. The indicators again are direct: reduce marine pollution, protect and restore ecosystem, reduction in ocean acidification, reduction in fish stocks and maintaining them within sustainable levels, protected marine areas, combating illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and income from sustainable fisheries. Those are the indicators. The developmental indicators: research resources for marine technology, support small-scale fishers, and implementing international sea law. So these indicators need a very close look because they are not being implemented worldwide very well as of now. You can see that sustainability of ocean is under severe threat, and over 3 billion people rely on oceans. All this has come from the SDG 14 outputs, but there is so much more to be discussed in terms of fish stock diversification and use of mechanized fishing, in the context of sustainable development. That is not very well taken forward. That needs a closer look. Moving on to land, we can see indicators again are very robust to tell us what are the forested areas available, what are the important biodiversity sites which are protected, and how the land degradation is integrated with climate change into the national policies, and how their measures are prevalent in countrywide approaches to end desertification and land degradation. Coverage of important sites for mountain biodiversity preservation, and also the index such as Mountain Green Cover Index, Red List Index, which is also, of course, a very robust way to judge how the biodiversity changes have taken place over time, and the benefits of sharing genetic resource, which also connect with the SDG goal on food security. So these are the first set of targets and indicators which are very, very robust. If we see further on, wildlife poaching and trafficking statistics, preventing the alien invasive species in the on land. Actually, what is the statistic on invasive and alien species, and integration of ecosystem and biodiversity in planning. These are all outputs from science. Science very easily and positively contributes to data on all these issues. We have plethora of data, but the analysis is very important from the developmental targets you see here, A, B, and C. One is, what is the official development assistance to protect biodiversity? That is actually a practical indicator, again, for forest management and to protect wildlife. So these three, biodiversity, forest, and wildlife. Protection of this is given more developmental push, and the indicators are sufficient. But the indicators on land degradation constitute only one of the indicators which need further evolution, which is actually shown here. For example, within the terrestrial section itself, what is the difference in the global mean percentage of biodiversity area that has emerged from these sets of indicators? It is almost on par. You can see terrestrial 43%, freshwater 42%, and mountain 41%. So this is actually a very good way of assessing how the land biodiversity is correlated to the land productivity. So if we see to, with that, we come to actually the prime of the SDG goals, which actually directly connect with environmental or economic aspects. The 16 and 17 goals, as you can see, connect more with the social aspects and institutional frameworks. Here, the indicators are more qualitative and sometimes quantitative. For example, here you can see what are the number of intentional homicides, conflict-related deaths, prevalence of violence, and public safety. These have a mixture of qualitative and quantitative components, as in violence against children, human trafficking, sexual violence against young men and women, the reports of crimes through countries, sorted through countries. So detainees, unsentenced detainees in police stations or legal centers, how well the dispute resolution is happening, where is the illicit financial flow, how well the seized and surrendered arms are accounted for per country. Also the bribery prevalence and bribery in business. So these are all actually, you can say, largely qualitative. Further on, if we see targets such as governmental expenditures within budget to develop accountable and transparent institutions, that is a very, very important indicator. And this mentions what we say non-bias or no hiding of truth and transparent institutions. That is a very important indicator. Also, the satisfaction with public services among the citizens, it is termed as an indicator. So representation in public institutions and inclusive decision making will ensure responsive and inclusive societies. So that these two indicators are very robust in that sense. And finally, developing country participation in international organization. That is a national level framework. If we see indicators like birth registration, satisfaction again with public services, journalist and media killings, public access to information, national human rights institutions, and public discrimination again. These are sets of indicators which are derived from reports. So a journalistic report or human rights organizational report, they actually help us to quantify this. So now we know that there is an institutional framework which we can have to discuss this set of indicators. Now this has also actually revealed very critical, data. For example, killings of 331 human rights defenders were reported in 32 countries, which is shown an 18% increase since 2019. So there are some, bribery, for example, is at the core of need for interventional policy making at societal levels. So these are some things that have come out of looking at these indicators. And if we see 17, we look at very, very, very crucial sets of indicators like government revenue, taxes, assistance to least developed countries, foreign direct investment, remittances again for migrants. What is the investment and promotion of least developed countries? What is the debt service in each of the developing countries? Also, ICT based knowledge sharing, such as fixed broadband subscriptions, sustainable technologies adopted in developing countries, individuals who are using ICTs, especially the internet, this SDG support for developing countries in terms of capacity building, then average tariffs to promote a universal trading system which is adopted by each country under the WTO, and the number of exports from developing countries. So these are some very important set of indicators which are repetitive across all the other sets of indicators as we have seen before. So also moving forward, tariff, for example, for tariff for developing countries, the policy for sustainable development and the national framework. These are very well actually discussed. But if you see, there is also specific indicator like the macroeconomic dashboard, which will give an idea of how well the SDG 11, SDG 8, 11 and 10, these are being promoted across the nations. So this is actually interconnected to those SDGs as well. Also, progress in multi-stakeholder development, because the public participatory approach we saw in another SDG, SDG 10, which will reduce the inequalities. Public, private and civil society partnerships. What is the indicator on the statistical capacity to get reliable data sets? What is these sets of indicators? If you see say 18.1, 2, 3 and 19.1 and 2, these are very, very important national level data. Like this national statistical legislation, what are the statistical plans, how the data is going to be managed, whatever statistical data we are getting, how they are analyzed, what is the policy on that, what are the resources to collect that, and what is the completeness of these data sets. So those have resulted in very crucial outputs also. I'm not going to go into details here, but just to tell you that, the assistance rates per official development figures, those are very key indicators which have emerged out of these sets of indicators. Putting them together as composite indicators, we see that, for example, for every 100% in India, approximately 42% have access to internet, which is a result of growing partnership at global levels. So these are some very important ways in which interlinking of SDGs are happening. This particular figure, for example, tells you how the SDGs on land, water, food, energy, and materials, they are interconnected. So you can see, we can have almost all the SDGs here, right? You can take a closer look at this, and if you have any questions, we can definitely discuss this in detail. You have to understand that if you see here 2, 11, 14, 7, 13, 15, and yes, so those are the direct SDGs which are discussed. But there are other SDGs like 1, 3, 10, 16 and 17, which are implicit in achieving the SDG targets, which are interlinked here, right? Also, not only from the materials point of view, but also from the development point of view. There is material supply systems point of view. There is also secondary inputs use point of view. There are direct and indirect ways to achieve, and these indicators will represent how these targets are achieved. So if we have, if you see Niti Aayog, there are several state level schemes and programs which contribute to the data on these indicators. Although they are very less, you can see that the focus of indicators can be different at different years. And we have a robust set of national missions which are indicated here to focus on, different SDGs itself. Like MG and Riga scheme is one of the very good and robust ways to study rural employment schemes. So like that, there are several other schemes which are shown here. You can always go to the Niti Aayog website to check this out. So with that, I stop today. Thank you for your attention. I think we have taken a huge time today to discuss this, but I feel that this is very important because we are having a comprehensive outlook about what are the different types of indicators, and because we should know that it is not possible for each of us to sit and read through all these indicators. We have done a sort of a combined approach to this today, and be happy to answer any questions. I'm really apologize for the overshot in time, but I hope that it is useful to you all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the session, madam. I have a couple of questions. One is,